In 2019, Netflix dared to ask, what if Bohemian Rhapsody was terrible? The Dirt. Motley Crue formed in 1981 when bassist Nikki Sixx met drummer Tommy Lee. They would then recruit lead guitarist Mick Mars and lead singer Vince Neil. The band released their first album, Too Fast for Love, themselves in 1981, which caught the attention of Elektra Records, who signed them and reissued the album in 1982. Motley Crue quickly became one of the biggest hair metal bands of the 80s, with catchy pop-punk hits, a fun stage show, and seemingly endless controversies. These include drunk driving, manslaughter, spousal abuse, drug overdoses, racial slurs, the list just goes on and on. The 90s were tough for the Crue. Right as grunge was taking over and making them irrelevant, Neil quit or was fired. They've never gotten their story straight on that one. Elektra forced the band to reunite with Neil a few years later, but that did little to help, and Lee quit the band soon after. The band took a break in the early 2000s to focus on solo projects, but in 2001 they published a novel, The Dirt. It was written by the various members and their former managers, all giving insight into the band's history. It's a fascinating read. My copy is basically falling apart from how much I read it as a kid. Paramount purchased the film rights to the book in 2006, but the project languished in development hell for almost a decade. Focus Features tried their hand at it in 2015, before Netflix bought the rights in 2017. Jeff Tremaine was hired to direct the film. His only previous directing credits are the Jackass series of movies and the spin-off Bad Grandpa. The script is written by Rich Wilkes and Amanda Adelson. The former's resume includes XXX, while The Dirt is the latter's first screenplay. Safe hands. And of course, the band members are all producers along with their current management team. The film tells the story of the band's formation before quickly running through a list of infamous Motley Crue stories and ending by combining the 90s split with Neil and their 2005 reunion. I lost interest in the potential of a Motley Crue biopic when I saw I, Tonya, the Tonya Harding biopic starring Margot Robbie. That film really is what The Dirt could and should have been. If you haven't seen it, the movie uses interviews with the characters as a framing device. It's a controversial story with contradictory sides, and the movie has fun with that. There are scenes where Robbie's Tonya will turn to the camera and say, "This never happened." That film cleverly uses multiple unreliable narrators to weave together an engaging story. In The Dirt, there is no real framing device, even though they could. The interview idea is so easy. Instead, the four band members narrate and inconsistently break the fourth wall, and it just doesn't work. A big part of what made the Dirt book so much fun was the band members constantly contradicting each other. One chapter would be a story from Neil's point of view, while the next chapter would be the same story from Lee's perspective, and it would be entirely different. The filmmakers could have had so much fun with that. One of my favorite stories from Motley Crue's history is Neil quitting or being fired. Neil insists that he was fired, while Sixx still claims that he quit. How cool would it have been to showcase that in the film? Like, show the scene from Sixx's point of view, and then do the scene again, but from Neil's. The film could be comprised of 4 vignettes. Tell the story from Sixx's point of view, and then when you're done, switch to another member, and so on till you got through all 4. There was so much potential here to make something interesting and maybe even unconventional. What we got instead is basically a glorified Wikipedia page. It has a checklist of specific Motley Crue events it wants to hit, and stuffs as many as possible into the runtime. There's no real structure or flow to the story. Scenes don't lead into one another. It's just shit happening. For example, the movie, of course, shows the death of Razzle. For anyone who doesn't know, Razzle was the drummer for Hanoi Rocks. The two bands were partying together. Neil and Razzle went to get more beer. Neil drove while intoxicated and caused a wreck that took Razzle's life. 1. The movie has zero taste regarding this matter. The script features a joke in which Neil tells Razzle that he's gonna die right before the crash happens. The movie also shows Razzle's mutilated face like it's an exploitation film or something. Razzle was an actual person that actually died. That's not okay, movie. 2. The movie has Lee meet Heather Locklear at the same party. Lee and Locklear were married for a few years as depicted in the film. But they didn't meet the night Razzle died, and it's a super weird choice to do that. 3. Like 20 to 30 minutes later, Neil is complaining about not getting to drink on tour. And yeah, I'm aware that Neil didn't stop drinking, but it reads as especially cold when it's condensed down like this, which means the razzle sequence is pointless. It has no bearing on the plot. It just happens, and then the movie moves on to the next thing, Six's heroin addiction. And the transition is just bad narration. Hell, the band going to rehab is time jumped over. Screw character development, we have another shitty looking montage to get to. The Heroin Diaries is a great story and could be a movie entirely on its own, because there was substance. Six opened himself up, warts and all, with that book. You could really understand the guy and the abject horror and tragedy of addiction. In this movie, the deepest it gets is narration from Lee where he's like, "Dude, Six was in like a dark place, dude." Thanks, Tommy. Let's talk about the third act because it's really bad. Most Hollywood films follow a 3-act structure. The first act is the introduction, establishing characters and setting, usually ending on a status quo change. For example, the first act of A Nightmare on Elm Street introduces Nancy and a group of friends, the idea that they're having nightmares, teases a Freddy, and ends with Tina's death. That event kicks off the story proper. The second act is the story. It's the movie, the thing you're here to see. This explanation is oversimplified, by the way. It's a little more complicated than this. The acts themselves have structures. The second act usually ends with the character's lowest moment, leading into the climax or a point of no return. The third act is then the resolution of the story. The lowest moment of Elm Street is Glenn's death. Nancy's boyfriend is dead, her mom is passed out drunk, and her dad thinks she's nuts. She has to go face Freddy alone, and that decision is the climax, and everything after is the resolution. Now, The Dirt does not have to fall into that. Movies aren't math. But it does try to fit into a conventional 3-act structure, and it doesn't work. The end of Act 2 and the entirety of Act 3 are especially rough. Each member of the band has its own lowest moment. Kind of. Mars is such an afterthought in this movie, but the two biggest ones are the death of Neil's daughter Skylar and the band not being as popular with Neil's replacement, John Corabi. Do you see the problem there? One of these things is not like the other. It is such a whiplash to watch the movie awkwardly cut between a child dying of cancer and Six moping because he didn't sell enough tickets. It's a little tone deaf, but also neither is really satisfying as the conclusion of this movie because there's no story. The movie is not about Skylar or Neil's relationship with her. They actually had her be born much earlier than she was in real life so that she could be in more of the movie, but even then, she's barely in it. Her death is kind of the climax, if the movie has one at all, although it could be argued that the climax is Six getting the band booted from their label. I will say that Skylar's illness is the only part of the movie that moved me. I can't imagine what it's like to watch your own child die. That's horrifying, and you do feel a tremendous amount of sympathy for Neil. But it serves no purpose to the narrative. Skylar's death doesn't lead into Neil rejoining the crew or reconnecting with his band. That's entirely motivated by Six's daddy issues. It's bizarre and unfocused with no real build or release of tension, which is a decent description of the entire movie. Also, I hate the way they handle Corabi. The movie never names him, only referring to him as some guy and constantly saying that the crew sucks without Neil. The self-titled album Motley Crue did with Corabi is their best album. Don't at me. I have no idea why Six has such a hate boner for Corabi these days, and it's petty that it affected the movie the way that it did. Making its Netflix debut in early 2019, The Dirt received mostly negative reviews because it sucks. It's impossible to tell whether it was successful or not. The streaming services never released their numbers, allowing the studios to form whatever narrative they want. This movie is so awful. I regretted picking it to review the second I started watching it. It is a chore to sit through. The pacing is awful and there's no story. Brian Tallarico of RogerEbert.com described it best when he referred to it as an R-rated Wikipedia page. It's barely a movie, only existing to stroke the egos of the band members. everyone is better off just reading The Dirt or The Heroin Diaries.